Jesus. I have your contract. I have your mother's land. I have every document your firm has filed in the last 6 years. I have a press release scheduled for midnight that will make sure you never restore another building in any city on this continent. So sit down, smile, and discuss my terms like a professional.
The champagne glass hit the marble floor before anyone understood what had happened. Not dropped, knocked. The back of Director Charles's hand had swept it from the table in one contemptuous arc, and the sound of it shattering was the only sound in the room for a full 3 seconds, the kind of 3 seconds that feel like someone has pressed pause on the entire world. Chidera did not flinch. She stood with her back straight and her braids pinned at the crown of her neck, wearing a gold silk dress that she had spent 3 months saving for because she had known that tonight would require armor. Her cheek was not touched, but the gesture had been aimed at her. Everyone in that room understood what it was aimed at. Director Charles smiled. It was the smile of a man who had done this before and had never once been corrected. "I have your contract," he said, loudly enough for the nearest 3 tables to hear. "I have your mother's land. I have every document your firm has filed in the last 6 years, and I have a press release scheduled for midnight that will make sure you never restore another building in any city on this continent." He straightened his cufflinks. The gray of his suit was immaculate. His hands were perfectly steady. "So sit down, smile, and discuss my terms like a professional." The gala had gone very quiet. 3 phones had already risen above the crowd like periscopes. The sommelier near the east wall had become a statue. The string quartet in the corner was still playing, something soft and French and completely inappropriate, but the sound felt like it was coming from another country. Chidera pressed her fingers against the edge of the table. Her jaw was set. Her eyes were bright, not with tears, but with something older and sharper than tears. She had the look of a woman who had survived every version of this moment before, who had learned exactly what it cost to collapse in public, and who had decided, with the full weight of her architecture degree, and her mother's name, and her father's unfinished drawings, that she would not give this room the satisfaction. Director Charles raised his hand, not to strike, but to snap his fingers at her like she was a member of his service staff. A hand closed around his wrist. It came from behind him. One hand, no warning. The grip didn't wrench or twist. It simply stopped Director Charles's arm mid-motion with a quiet, absolute authority, the way a wall stops a door. Director Charles turned. The man behind him was not what anyone in that ballroom would have predicted. He was not large. He was not performing. He wore a black silk shirt with the top 2 buttons open and dark trousers, and he held Director Charles's wrist in one hand as though he had simply picked up something that had been set down carelessly. His face was angular and still. His jaw was sharp. His eyes were the kind of flat, direct, completely unemotional that people spend entire careers trying to manufacture and almost never achieve. He looked at Director Charles for exactly 1 moment. Then he released the wrist, reached past him, and placed his hand on the edge of the table, calmly, the way a man claims a seat at a board meeting. He took out his phone, tapped once, twice, a 3rd time, and then he held the screen in front of Director Charles's face. "Check your phone," he said. His voice was low. He spoke the way certain doors close, with a precision that makes the silence after it feel sealed. "You have nothing left." Director Charles's phone buzzed, then it buzzed again. Then it began to buzz continuously, the way phones do when the world is suddenly trying to reach you all at once. Director Charles looked down at his screen. His face, that immaculate, controlled press conference face, did something it had not done in over a decade. It broke. The man did not watch him break. He had already turned away. He turned toward but turned. Chidera. And he looked at her. At the tension in her shoulders that she had spent the last 4 minutes holding so still it had become its own kind of monument, at her hands gripping the table's edge, at the controlled devastation behind her eyes. And he looked at her the way no one else in that ballroom had looked at her all evening, like she was the only person in the room worth protecting. His name was Sunju. But here is what nobody in that ballroom knew. The man who had just dismantled Director Charles's entire empire with 3 taps of a phone, the man who had stepped out of the shadows at exactly the right moment, had not come to this gala by accident. He had been watching Chidera Obi for 3 years, and tonight was not the beginning of the story. It was the end of the part she was never supposed to find out about. Now, before the story goes somewhere nobody in that ballroom saw coming, do me a quick favor. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. Seriously, I want to know. And if this story hits you the way I think it will, subscribe and turn on your notifications before you forget. Because the place this is going, not a single person in that room was prepared for it, and neither will you. Now, let's begin. Seoul wakes up before its people do. By the time Chidera Obi arrived at the Bukchon site at 6:47 in the morning, the street vendors were already arranging their tables and the generator on the 3rd floor of the adjacent building had been running for 2 hours. She stood in front of the crumbling courtyard entrance, original Joseon-era stonework, 1887, partially buried under decades of bad repointing, and drank her coffee black because she'd forgotten to buy milk again, and looked at the building the way a doctor looks at a patient they are not yet sure they can save. She had been looking at this building for 3 years. It was her mother's inheritance, her grandmother's, childhood. The last standing structure of a family that had once been one of the most prominent merchant households in the old city. The deed was hers. The restoration permits were hers. The funding, scraped together from grants and 2 international heritage foundations, and 1 anonymous private client whose wire transfers arrived every quarter with nothing attached but a reference number, was hers. The threat was also hers. Director Charles had made the offer 6 months ago. She had declined it 6 months ago. He had made it again with a lawyer present 8 weeks ago. She had declined it again with her own lawyer present and a very precise letter outlining her legal position. He had responded not with another lawyer, but with a withdrawal notice, her permits, revoked overnight through a set of municipal connections she hadn't known he had. And then he had sent, via a courier, a manila envelope containing photographs of every financial irregularity, real and manufactured, in her firm's last 6 years of operation. She had read the envelope contents in her car. She had sat with them for 17 minutes. Then she had driven home, called her mother to tell her everything was fine, and spent the rest of the night rebuilding her case from the foundation. Chidera Obi did not collapse. She restructured. But there were limits to what one woman could reconstruct alone, and she was beginning to understand that she was approaching them. What she did not know, what she had no reason to know, was that there was someone who had been watching the approach of those limits for 3 years. Someone who had been making certain, very quietly and very carefully, that she had not yet reached them. Someone who, 48 hours before the night that changed everything, had already set the final pieces in motion. The question the city of Seoul could not yet answer, the question Chidera herself would not think to ask until it was already answered, was this: why would the most dangerous man in the city's shadow network spend 3 years protecting a woman he had never officially met? The gala had not yet fully exhaled when Sunju's hand found the small of her back. Not possessive, not performative. The kind of touch that says, I have you without making a sound. 2 fingers through gold silk, steering her away from the wreckage of Director Charles's public collapse and toward the exit before the room could remember to breathe. Chidera did not pull away. She did not lean in either. She walked with her spine straight and her chin up and her heart doing something she would not name until much later, when she was alone enough to be honest about it. Behind them, Director Charles was still staring at his phone. The string quartet had stopped playing. 300 people stood in absolute silence and watched the most powerful developer in Seoul's Heritage District discover in real time that his offshore accounts had been reduced to a single, luminous zero. Some of them were recording. Some of them were calling. All of them would remember exactly where they were standing when it happened, the way people remember earthquakes, not the sound, but the stillness right before. Sunju did not look back once. His penthouse was on the 41st floor of a building that did not have a publicly listed address. Chidera learned this when the car stopped in front of an unmarked entrance, and the driver, who had not spoken a single word, opened her door with the practiced discretion of someone paid very well to have no opinions. The elevator opened directly into the apartment. She stepped inside and understood immediately why it felt the way it did. Every surface was dark, Black stone floors, dark paneled walls, floor-to-ceiling windows that turned the city into a painting. Seoul glittered 41 floors below, like a circuit board someone had left running. The rain had started. Again. Soft and relentless, tracing lines down the glass. It was the most beautiful room she had ever stood in. It felt nothing like a home. "You can sleep in the second room," Sunju said. He had already removed his jacket. His black shirt caught the city light the same way it had caught the neon at the gala, as though light simply made decisions differently around him. "No one knows this address. You'll be safe until morning." Chidera set her clutch on the nearest surface and turned to face him. "I don't need to be kept safe. I need to clear my permits and counter whatever Director Charles filed before midnight." "That's already handled." She looked at him. "By whom?" He looked back at her. He had the kind of face that gave nothing away voluntarily. Every expression a controlled release, nothing accidental. "Get some sleep, Chidera." It was the first time he had used her name, she noticed. She did not say so. She picked up her clutch and walked toward the second room, and told herself the thing she was feeling was simply exhaustion. She almost believed it. By 2 a.m, she was back at the long table in his main room, her restoration files spread across the digital surface, her heels abandoned somewhere near the kitchen. Sunju had not slept either. He sat across from her with a tablet and a glass of water and the focused quiet of a man entirely accustomed to operating in the middle of the night. They worked in silence for an hour. It was the most companionable silence Chidera had experienced in 3 years of working alone, the kind that doesn't ask anything of you, that simply holds space for concentration. She had forgotten such silences existed. She was cross-referencing a permit filing against a city heritage record when she reached for the screen to zoom in, and his hand was already there. Their fingers met over the glass surface. Neither of them moved. The document glowed beneath their hands, dates and reference numbers, and the bureaucratic language of a city that had no idea what was happening 41 floors above it. Neither of them was looking at the document. Sunju's eyes were on her face. Chidera's eyes were on his. The city hummed below. The rain continued its patient conversation with the glass. Somewhere in the building, a lift moved between floors, a distant mechanical breath. She did not pull her hand away. He did not pull his. It lasted the length of something that cannot be measured in seconds. The kind of moment that exists outside of time, that you carry afterward in your chest like a small, inexplicable weight. Then Chidera turned back to the screen. Sunju moved his hand. Neither of them said a word. But the silence after that was a different kind of silence entirely. The informant's name was Minjae, and he drank at a club in Gangnam that cost 400,000 won at the door and served everything in crystal that probably shouldn't be used for drinking. Sunju had a fight-y table in the back that appeared to be permanently reserved for him. The host did not ask his name. The crowd parted for him the way crowds do for people they have decided, without discussion, to be afraid of. Chidera walked beside him in the same gold dress, she had nothing else, and understood, watching the room adjust itself around his presence, something new about the man she was moving through Seoul with. He was not powerful the way Director Charles was powerful. Director Charles's power was loud, purchased, performed, a suit that cost a statement, a threat delivered at volume. Sunju's power was the other kind, the kind that does not need an audience, the kind that simply exists, the way weather exists, and you either account for it or you don't. Minjae was at the bar. He saw Sunju first and straightened in the way people straighten when they owe someone something significant. He saw Chidera second, and something shifted in his expression that she had learned to recognize in rooms like this, an assessment, a calculation, an intention forming. Sunju placed his hand on her waist, not 2 fingers this time. His full hand, deliberate and unhurried at the curve of her waist, and he angled his body slightly in front of hers, not blocking her, never that, but positioning himself between her and whatever Minjae had been about to decide. He said one word to Minjae in Korean, low and even. Later she would ask what it meant. He would take a long moment before answering. Mine. Minjae gave them everything they needed inside 20 minutes. He did not look at Chidera again. They were 40 meters from the car when the first of them stepped out of the alley. Chidera counted 3 before Sunju's hand closed around her wrist. and he said, very quietly, "Don't stop walking." She didn't. She matched his pace exactly, her gold dress catching the wet light of the street, her heart doing the opposite of what her face was doing, which was nothing, because she had learned from the best in the past 48 hours that the most dangerous thing you can do in front of dangerous people is show them what you're feeling. The motorcycle was parked at the end of the block. She did not ask whose it was. Sunju swung onto it with the fluid economy of someone who had done this before, in this city, in other cities, in other versions of exactly this situation, and looked at her over his shoulder with an expression that was, for the first time, the faintest edge of something urgent. She gathered her dress, swung her leg over, and wrapped her arms around him. His silk shirt was damp from the rain. She could feel the steadiness of him beneath it, his breathing controlled, his body already leaning into the first turn before the engine had fully caught. The city streaked past them in amber and teal, the rain coming sideways now, the sound of it swallowed by the wind. She held on. Behind them, the cleanup crew reached the end of the block and found nothing but wet tarmac and the fading sound of an engine disappearing into the Seoul night. Sunju did not slow down for another 6 minutes. When he finally did, pulling onto a quiet, elevated road above the river, the city spread below them like something that had no idea what had just moved through it. Chidera loosened her arms slightly. Not fully. Just enough to breathe. She felt him exhale beneath her hands. Just once. Just barely. And she understood, with a certainty she could not explain and would not question, that she was the only person in the world who had ever been close enough to notice it. If you have ever held on to something, or someone, tighter than you planned to because letting go felt like the more dangerous choice, this story is for you. Stay with us. Because what happens next is the part nobody sees coming. By the third day, the tension of the first night had settled into something resembling routine. If routine could be defined as two people carefully not talking about the thing filling every room between them. She found the ingredients at a market in Mapo-gu, a small Nigerian grocery tucked between a dry cleaner and a phone repair shop, run by a woman named Adaez, who had been in Seoul for 11 years and hugged Chidera like she already knew her. Chidera bought palm oil and crayfish and the particular kind of stockfish that her grandmother had always insisted on, and carried them back to Sunju's dark kitchen like she was carrying something sacred. Which, in a way, she was. Sunju stood at the kitchen island and watched her cook with the focused attention he gave everything, still, observant, missing nothing. She had expected him to leave the room. He didn't. He watched her hands move through the preparation the way he had watched the city from his window, like he was trying to understand something that could not be explained with data. "My grandmother made this every Sunday," Chidera said without looking up. "In the house I'm trying to restore. The smell would get into everything. The curtains, the walls, the wood of the staircase. Years later, after she was gone, you could still find it if you knew where to press your hand." Sunju said nothing, but he didn't move either. She set a bowl in front of him, a goosey soup, rich and deep, with a mound of pounded yam on the side. He looked at it with the expression of a man conducting a careful risk assessment. "Use your hand," she said. He looked at her. "That is how it is eaten." A long pause. Then Sunju reached into the bowl with a precision that was so characteristically him that Chidera had to look away to keep from smiling. He ate. She watched the moment it registered on his face, the involuntary softening, the slight widening of the eyes, the way his jaw slowed as though his body needed more time to process something this unexpectedly good. He ate the entire bowl without speaking. When he finished, he looked up at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, something undefended. Something that had not yet decided whether it was safe to exist in the open. "My grandmother would have liked you," Chidera said quietly. Sunju looked at his empty bowl. "She would have seen through you immediately," Chidera added. "She liked people she couldn't fool." The corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile. It was the architecture of one, the foundation laid, the walls not yet built. But it was the most unguarded thing she had ever seen on his face, and she filed it somewhere she knew she would return to. He told her that night. They were at the window, the city doing what Seoul does at midnight, glittering without apology, indifferent to the people watching it. Chidera had her arms folded against the glass, her reflection layered over the lights below. Sunju stood beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him without contact. He said, 3 years ago, I was asked to assess a heritage site in Bukchon. Routine due diligence for a client who wanted to buy it quietly. A pause. I read your restoration proposal instead, the one you had filed with the city. Chidera turned her head slightly. You had documented everything, he continued. Every stone, every beam, the original mortar composition, the Joseon-era drainage system, the way the northeastern wall had shifted 4 degrees over 100 years, and why that shift was proof of the original builder's intention rather than structural failure. Another pause, longer. You had written 300 pages about a building most people would have demolished in a weekend. Because to you it wasn't a building, it was a record. Proof that someone had been there, had mattered, had built something intended to outlast them. The city hummed below them. I canceled the assessment, he said. I declined the client. And I made sure the funding reached you before the first. Grant cycle closed. Chidera did not speak for a long time. When she did, her voice was very quiet. You could have told me. You would have refused it. She would have. They both knew it. Why? She asked. Not about the money, about all of it. About 3 years of invisible guardianship, about a man who operated entirely in shadow choosing, for reasons that had nothing to do with transaction, to put himself between her and the dark. Sunju was quiet for long enough that she thought he would not answer. Then, because someone should. It was not the grand confession she might have written for him. It was quieter than that, and more true. And it landed somewhere in her chest with the particular weight of something that does not need elaboration. She turned back to the window. He did not move. They stood like that for a long time, their reflections side by side in the glass, the city endlessly bright below them, neither of them reaching for the other, and both of them, in the particular way of people who have stopped pretending, completely undone. The photograph was published at 7 a.m., Chidera saw it on her phone before she was fully awake, a shot taken from a distance, grainy with zoom, showing her and Sunju leaving a restaurant 2 nights ago. Her hand on his arm, his head angled toward her. The caption underneath was 3 lines of implication that didn't need to say anything directly to say everything. The headline read, Fixer and Heritage Activist, Seoul's Most Dangerous Alliance, or something more personal. Below it, a second image. Sunju at a different location 6 months earlier, standing with director Charles, smiling. She was dressed and out of the penthouse in 11 minutes. She did not leave a note. She did not trust herself to write one without saying things that would require her to be in a room with him to say them, and she was not ready for that room. Her chest felt like the morning after something structural had given way. Not collapsed, not yet, but shifted in a way that would need to be accounted for. She had been wrong before. She had built her life around a misreading before. She had done the work of trusting someone only to find the foundation was not what she thought. She told herself she was not doing that again. She told herself this all the way to the Bukchon site, where she stood in front of the old courtyard entrance in the early morning light and pressed her hand against the stone the way her grandmother had taught her, and tried to find the part of herself that knew how to rebuild from the ground. Her phone rang 4 times. She did not answer. On the 5th call, she picked up. Sunju's voice was exactly as it always was, level, precise, containing everything and revealing only what he chose. He said, The photograph was taken by Director Charles's communications team and placed 2 weeks ago, held for use if we got close. The image of me with Charles is from a government mediation I was required to attend. His legal team subpoenaed my presence. A pause. I have the documentation. Chidera stood in the courtyard. The morning light came through the gap in the old walls the same way it always had. At an angle her grandmother had once said proved the original architect understood something about patience. I know, Sunju said, quieter now, that you have reasons not to believe that. I know what the photograph was designed to make you feel, and I know you well enough to know that you are standing somewhere alone right now, deciding whether to restructure or collapse. The briefest pause. Don't collapse, Chidera. Not over something he built to break you. She closed her eyes. She did not collapse. Director Charles chose the rooftop. Perhaps he thought the height gave him something. Perhaps he needed the open sky above him after days of watching every ceiling close in. He stood at the glass railing with his phone in his hand and the desperate composure of a man performing confidence for an audience of zero. And when Sunju walked Chidera through the rooftop door, he looked at them both with the particular hatred of someone who has confused his money for his worth and is only now understanding the difference. He had one thing left: a folder. Physical, printed, old-fashioned, the kind of evidence that predates the digital system Sunju had already cleared. Photographs, testimonies, a paper trail that led back to a procurement irregularity in Chidera's firm from 4 years ago, real enough to be damaging, incomplete enough to be a lie. He held it up like a weapon. Sunju's hands settled on Chidera's shoulders from behind, not gripping, not directing, simply there, the weight of them steady and warm, the way a foundation is steady, the way certainty feels when it is given rather than performed. She felt it move through her like something unlocking. Chidera reached into her bag and removed her own folder. She had found the procurement irregularity herself 3 years ago when she had first inherited the firm's records. She had traced it, documented it, identified the third party who had manufactured it, and filed a sealed report with the Heritage Authority that she had been holding in reserve for the precise moment it was needed most. She placed the folder on the table between them. "That is the full record," she said, including the name of the person Director Charles paid to create the irregularity, including the bank transfers, including the dates. She held his gaze without flinching. "Would you like to open it here, or would you prefer I send it directly to the press?" Director Charles opened his own phone with shaking hands, looking perhaps for a counter, for a remaining asset, for anything at all. The screen showed him what it had shown him at the gala. $0. Sunju had been thorough. He had always been thorough. Director Charles looked at the zero for a long time. The Seoul skyline held itself around them, indifferent and luminous, a city that had seen the rise and fall of men far more careful than him. The wind moved across the rooftop. Somewhere below, the city continued without him. He sat down, not dramatically, not with the collapse of a man undone in a single moment. Simply, he sat down in a rooftop chair with his dead phone in his hand and became someone who used to be powerful. The city took 3 days to exhale. Then the deed arrived. Not through a courier, not through a lawyer. Sunju placed it on the kitchen island while Chidera was drinking her morning coffee, her coffee now with milk because he had remembered, and stepped back with his hands in his pockets and the expression he wore when he was feeling something he had not yet found language for. She looked at the document, the Bukchan site, her mother's name in the property history, her grandmother's address, recorded in the official transfer as the original, residence of the founding family, and at the bottom, the new deed of ownership. Her name, registered, sealed, irrevocable. "You didn't have to do this," she said. "I know. The permits are already restored. The funding is secured. I had a path." "I know that too." She looked up at him. He was watching her with that expression, the one she had first seen over an empty bowl of agusi soup, the one that had no armor in it, the one that was simply him, standing in his own kitchen in the morning light, having given her what no one else ever had. "Sunju." "Yes?" "This is the part," she said carefully, "where I would normally tell you I don't need it. I know. But my grandmother built that house to outlast her." She set down her coffee. "And I think," a pause, the kind she had learned from him, the kind that only holds what it means, that some things are meant to be shared. He crossed the kitchen in 4 steps. He did not reach for her dramatically. He simply, stood in front of her, close enough that the city behind him was only light and distance, and looked at her the way he always looked at her, like she was the only person in the room worth protecting, except that now there was no room, no threat, no audience. Just morning and coffee going cold, and a deed on the counter between them that said in the formal language of law what he had been saying in silence for 3 years. She reached up and placed her hand against his jaw. He closed his eyes. Just once. Just briefly. It was the most unguarded she had ever seen him, and she understood, with the full weight of everything they had moved through together to arrive at this particular morning, that this was what he had been protecting all along. Not the building, not the deed, her. And just like that, The most dangerous man in Seoul is standing in a kitchen at 8 a.m., eyes closed, her hand on his jaw, undone by nothing more than the weight of being finally fully known. But before you exhale, you need to understand something. Sunju has a past that Chidera hasn't found yet. There's a name in his files, one that connects back to her family's history in a way that neither of them saw coming, one that will make you question everything you just watched him do. And then, when the full truth lands, make you love him more fiercely than you already do. And Chidera, she's about to receive an offer, international, career-defining, the kind that requires her to choose, for the first time in her life, not between strength and surrender, but between the empire she built alone and the one she could build with someone beside her. That chapter is already written. The question is whether you will be here when it drops. Subscribe right now, not later, not after one more scroll, right now, so the next chapter finds you. Hit that notification bell so you are the first to know, and drop a comment below telling me this. Are you Team Let her go build her empire, or Team Sunju better not let her walk out that door? Because where this goes next depends on how well you know these two. And I promise you, you are not ready for what he does when he realizes she is actually considering leaving. The next chapter's coming. Make sure you're here for it.